This video will demonstrate how to do light baking on the midterm assignment. So here I'm going to do the dresser with the lamp, and there's two parts to it. Whenever there are pieces that need to be smoothed and not within the same geometry group, I would just combine them separately. In this case, pretty much everything except the actual pages within this one book have been combined in this smooth group. And leading up to this point, so if you want to do any kind of light baking on your own projects, just remember to use the script. The latest version of this script was provided to you in the class folder, and the important thing is after everything gets laid out, then you need to go back and make sure that all of the surface areas are of the correct proportional size. So for example, these UVs here represent the outer cover of this book, and they are, as you can see, about the right proportional surface area to the lamp and the table and everything else. An important part of streamlining the process for baking in Maya is, as I informed you guys about in the latest version of the ref, I combined the geometry, and the usefulness for that is that instead of, when it comes down to reapplying the textures and shaders of the baked result, we only have to work with a fairly small limited set of objects that we have to relink their UVs. So originally this group of geometry, I believe, had something like a dozen or so parts to it, and now we're down to just two, which just makes it a lot easier. And also, as what I did here for organizational purposes, I had all of the geometry groups within their own display layers. The usefulness for it is, one, of course, you can toggle off and on the visibility of individual layers, and also, if you're looking at the scene as a whole and you had more things turned on, you can very easily choose the objects within a given layer. I'm just going to select something else, and then if I wanted to select all the items within this geometry group, I just right click over the appropriate display layer which contains them and choose select objects, and this is a very quick way of selecting everything that is within the layer. I've added a spotlight, set to quadratic, intensity of 12,000, and for its shadow I have ray trace shadows turned on. The light radius is 5. Light radius, think of it as the softness of the light, where if the light radius is at 0, which it is at default, you will get perfectly crisp, sharp shadows, which are very unnatural. So you're always going to want to have some value in here for light radius. For sun during midday, I would usually have a light radius of around 1. And the shadow rays has to do with the quality or the amount of sampling for whenever it blurs via the light radius. In this case, since I'm baking for production with a light radius of 5, I'm going to want something fairly high. Generally speaking, you're going to want to have for production about 8 to 16 rays per degree of light radius. So light radius is measured in degrees, and I have 8 to 16 per degree. Of course, this is well under that, but then again, I don't want to wait around forever. So if you have your light radius at 5, then 32 shadow rays is probably the max you will use as well. You may have noticed that my textures look a little different now. I changed the renderer from viewport 2.0 to legacy default viewport So there's pros and cons to this. The pro being that you don't get those constant delays in which Viewport 2.0 is recalculating every time you change a light or add stuff to the scene. But on the downside, the texture will look a little bit different than what it did in Viewport 2.0, and sometimes the texture might not even look correct in this mode as compared to Viewport 2.0. So if you want accuracy over performance, go with Viewport 2.0. If you want it the other way around, go with the default legacy viewport. Before we bake, we need to enable some of the objects that will be interacting with this geometry. So I put all of the metallic pieces in this display layer called not baked metal pieces. So we're going to need to make that one visible. And it also brings up a lot of other stuff that we're not going to need. Instead of just hiding these pieces and having to deal with going in and unhiding them later on, let's go ahead and just take the selection and create a render layer for it. We'll need to create a render layer eventually when we finish the bake and we want to assign a new material to this desk without messing up the original materials that are on it. And the way we can do that is by creating the render layer. And also that's a way of kind of isolating this geometry, an alternative to just having to go through and hide all these. So I'm going to select, I'm just going to marquee select everything here. I'm going into the render tab for render layers, and I'm going to click on this button that says create new layer and assign selected objects. This is a little different from how I explained it in the documentation, but it works and probably is even a little more efficient, since when you duplicate the master layer it also brings along everything else, whereas if you click to select the new layer 1 that was created, everything else is not a part of the layer. Nothing got deleted, of course, everything's still there. If you go back to the master layer, it's all still there. But one of the really nice things about display layers is how it's basically like think of it as like a quarantine area in which a lot of the changes that you can make to the shaders and how you render it is confined to just this layer and will not retroactively affect the other layers. So let's go ahead and rename this whatever's appropriate for the piece that you're baking. I'm calling this my lamp dresser, and I usually use RL, which is the suffix for render layer. Let's not forget about the IBL, so I'm going to go into Outliner, and this IBL was hidden, and I'm just going to Shift H to unhide it. Okay, and notice how it starts showing up because when I originally created this render layer, lamp dresser RL, the IBL was hidden, and therefore, and also we did not select it to include it within this layer. So what we can do at this point is right click over the render layer that we created and add selected objects. Okay, and there it is. And you can do this for if you forget to add certain parts. Let's say, for example, when you first created your render layer and you forgot to add the handles, you can just go back to your master layer where everything is, select those pieces, and then right click over your render layer and then just add selected objects. And you can also remove objects, so if you no longer want them to show up in this render layer, you can go that way as well.